So we're going to explore what I call the first path and what Joseph Campbell termed as hearing the summons to the journey. But before we move ahead, just a small recap of this approach so that you can better understand where I'm going in this discussion of the first path and the Gospel of Matthew. So my belief is that the early Christians, and by early Christians I mean the first 3 centuries of Christianity, knew and assumed from our Jewish mother that there was a definite 4-step or 4-path approach to how we walk with God in spirit. 4 was the number that we assumed from our mother Judaism. Don't go crazy over the number 4. It could be 4.5, it could be 7, it could be 11. 4 was the Jewish metaphor. We assumed that. Therefore, we were looking for the 4 gospel texts where each of the 4 texts would match one of the 4 paths or parts of the journey. Secondly, that the texts were intended to be texts of here and now. And Paul taught us this, that certainly we have the historical story of Jesus, but that's not how we tell the story, because Jesus is an eternal moment inside of time. Jesus is always a now and a here. And Paul taught us to see the stories of Jesus not as something that happened back then, but something that's happening right now in our present moment lives. Thirdly, Paul also taught us that we are followers of the Christ. We're followers of Jesus the Christ, but we're followers particularly of the Christ of all time. And so the Christ does not begin when Jesus is born. The Christ has always been. And Jesus is the manifestation in the flesh of the eternal Christ of all time. And finally, because Christianity in the 1st century and 2nd century was a developmental step in human consciousness, we could not simply bring people to Jesus. We had to create in them a path and a practice of transformation. So it is actually far easier to bring a person to understand Jesus than it is to form them in a certain way of living in a pan-tribal community, which we had not had on the planet to this moment, or at least we have no record of a pan-tribal community before the 1st century.
Why couldn't you just bring people to Jesus?
Certainly we can bring people to Jesus, but the second part of that story is we have to bring people to the way of Jesus. And Jesus created a new moment in human history because we had never lived pan-tribal before. In the presence of Jesus the Christ in the 1st century, we did something that we can find no antecedent of, which is people of differing tribes, people from differing bloodlines, people from differing parts of the globe, people from differing socioeconomic class, people of different gender, all of us sitting together as brother and sister in what we call the New Jerusalem. And to desire to become part of that community is the first step. But the second part of that is to learn how to live in a way with people that for your whole life you've been taught are the other, the enemy, the anathema, the outsider. And now they are your brother and sister. And no matter how much love brings us to the desire to live together as one, the practice of it takes training and formation. Therefore, the gospel in 4 parts was chosen, following the Jewish metaphor of Passover, to be the Christian way of understanding and following Jesus into this wider living in love, compassion, justice, vitality, creativity, etc. So now let's turn to the first path. Joseph Campbell's metaphor or way of naming the first path is hearing the summons, hearing the call to the journey. In Christianity, we're going to call this first path the text of the Gospel of Matthew. And now let's historically situate this gospel. It's coming out of the community, we believe, of Antioch. Antioch is about 100 miles north of Jerusalem. It's about 200 miles north of Jerusalem. It's about it's about a 1 week walk to walk from Jerusalem to Antioch. And what's happened is the temple in Jerusalem has been destroyed in 70. The Jewish priesthood has been ended by massacre because the Emperor Vespasian wanted to set his power on the empire, and he wanted to show his hand somewhere in the empire to bring order out of the chaos of the 3 emperors in 2 years that had preceded him. To do this, he decided to make an example of the Jewish people. Now, he didn't want to end the Jewish people. This was not Hitler. He wanted to end the Jewish faith because he believed that the Jewish religion had this festival every spring which taught them that they had overthrown the Pharaoh, and therefore it kept alive the belief that they could overthrow the Roman emperor. To end the Jewish faith, he knew he had to do 3 things. He had to annihilate the temple. He had to end the Jewish priesthood, which is a biological line. He had to end it by massacre. And thirdly, he wanted to destroy much of the holy city of Jerusalem. He almost succeeded in his plan. There were a few children from the lines of the Levites and the Cohens that were secreted out of Jerusalem. But by the time that those terrible days were over, the temple was gone and the holy city of Jerusalem was sacked. Much of it was torn down, and the Jewish people fled the holy city and didn't enter it for almost 40 years, believing that it had been, because of the sacrilege and the sacrifice and the martyrdom that had happened there, there was no desire to return to the great city. We turn now to Antioch because with Jerusalem effectively gone, Antioch is the city with the largest Jewish population in the Roman Empire. And the desire was to win the hearts of the Jewish people in Antioch for what was going to come next. And there was a major argument that was happening within Judaism at this point, and there were many, many positions. One position was, with the temple gone and the Jewish priesthood ended by massacre, this was the apocalypse, and that the end was at hand, and we should prepare ourselves to either die by flood or by fire.
I've heard that message before.
Yeah. And just as an aside, we should always know that whenever we are in a time of change, and the greater the change, the stronger you're going to hear this apocalyptic voice. It is a psychological truth that goes through millennia. Disregard it. Listen to it because it teaches us the level of change that we're in. But know that, for the most part, it is not the great truth of the moment. The second voice in Antioch was the voice of the moralist who was saying to the Jewish people, you're bad, you're sinful, that the destruction of the temple and the massacre of the priesthood happened because of your moral impurity. So if you will return to a stricter observance of the law, Yahweh will favor you and give you the strength and the means to go back and regain Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and rededicate the priesthood. Just as an aside, Judaism believes that they can't rededicate the priesthood without the temple. The third voice is the voice that perhaps many of us most identify with, and it's the voice of this afternoon I've got to get the kids to ballet, to soccer practice, I've got all this work to do. We're working so hard. When you theologians and political thinkers get all this solved, tell me, but in the moment, I just got to get to work and take care of my family. That's the upside of this. The downside of this is that we slip into all manner of addiction as a way to deaden the pain. The chaos and the questions are so large, I can't handle it. And so I'm just going to go to the pleasure principle and let someone else bear the responsibility of getting us out of this mess. The fourth position ends up being the position of we, the Jewish Christians of Antioch, hearing the text of the Gospel of Matthew. The text of the Gospel of Matthew said to them, and it says to us when we are in such a change moment, you can do the woulda, coulda, shoulda all you want, but when you're ready to take a step in growth, I'm here. Put your hand in mine and we'll move forward, even though the first place we move forward to is a place of uncertainty and trial. So this was the Christian Jewish population, because what they were hearing Jesus the Christ say in their midst is, in the midst of this chaotic, cataclysmic moment, this is not about shame, blame, or apocalypse, nor is it a matter of emotional paralysis. It's a matter of put your hand and your heart in mine and let's get back to work. There is a new and brighter future ahead. This is not that we look at the apocalypse and this cataclysmic moment as something that God deigned, but rather that no matter how dark and painful the moment may seem, God can make this work for our good. And this is the position of Matthew. And it starts with the way that Matthew tells the genealogy, which is a very, very strange genealogy, because right in the midst of this long passage, which we think is about patriarchy and all the fathers who begot, who begot, who begot. Well, first of all, the begot is that no matter how difficult times were, God's blessing remains. And secondly, in the midst of the genealogy, 5 times the genealogist tells us a very untoward story. Not a story that you would usually include in a genealogy, but what the genealogist is saying to us is, you think God comes to you because of moral purity? You think today is a bad day? Let me tell you your story. Let me tell you about Tamar, who is the daughter-in-law of Judah, who dresses as a Vestal virgin, which we in our polite language might call a woman of the evening, and prays that Judah might come to her and lie with her before he goes into the temple to pray. Remember, this is 4,000 years ago. So that she might conceive, because her husband has been killed and she's childless and she's about to be removed from the line of Abraham and the tribe of Judah, and she is so fearful. So she prays to God that God will have Judah come and lie with her and that she might conceive, and so she can stay part of the line of the coming Messiah. And this is what happens. But Judah is also very smart, because before she and Judah lie together, she asks Judah for his ring, because she knows that if she does conceive, that it will be Judah's right to have her executed for bringing shame on the family. And in fact, that's exactly what the scriptures tell us. They tell us that when Tamar began to show, and Judah hears the news, he pronounces the death sentence. And Tamar does not dispute the sentence. She only asks for the favor to meet with Judah before she's killed. And upon that meeting, she produces his ring. and we move on in the story of the line of the genealogy of Jesus the Christ. A line that over and over through these small stories that are inserted in the genealogy tell us, you think that this is a bad day for you. You think that your personal world is going to a certain place in a handbasket. You don't know your story very well. You don't know the life of Yahweh very well. You don't know the grace of Jesus the Christ. Because the text of Matthew can be summed up in this way. Whenever your personal life, whenever your corporate life, whenever your civic life, whenever the life on the planet turns to a time that you are going to call a moment of great darkness, this is not the end. It's the beginning. This is the sounding bell underneath the first path in the gospel text of Matthew, that whenever our personal and collective world is in a time of increasing darkness, encroaching darkness, this is not the end. This is the beginning. And so the great hope that pervades underneath the text of Matthew is that when you're in such a time, return to even deeper spiritual practice and return to the presence and the grace of Jesus the Christ. Yes, there is enormous work about, but the future is bright if we will continue our prayer, our practice, and our belief in that new future eventually arriving. So
when it's dark, the future is bright?
Absolutely. This is why in Judaism and in Christianity up until 500 years ago, we started our sacred day at sundown, because we wanted to teach ourselves every 24 hours that when you reach sundown, sundown marks the beginning moment of something new. Going into the dark is not, in the sacred way, going into the dark is not the end, it is the beginning. All new life. Where does new life begin? Whether it's deep in the earth or deep in the womb, it begins in the place of darkness. And from that darkness will come growth and beautiful, fresh radiance.
I thought if I got saved, I didn't have to go into the dark anymore.
You don't have to go into the dark without hope, but you do have to go into the dark because God made the holy darkness. As the 7-day story of creation, God created darkness and God created day, and God saw that all was good.
That's in the Bible?
That's in the Bible.
I'm going to have to read that.
Yeah. Actually, I think that many of the translations will say, and God created night and God created day, and God saw that all was good. So, there is so much in each story and chapter of Matthew. It continues to deepen our understanding of what the feeling, emotional feeling, and thinking content is when we're on the first path and we're walking it with Jesus the Christ. One of the next things that we'll hear in Matthew's text is, only in Matthew do we have brought forward the story of what Jesus said, you know what the law and the prophets have said to you, but now I say. And whatever comes after the now I say was stunning, and it appears like it is a reversal of what we've always known. It's not. But on the first path, it feels like it. Because in the past up to this day, we've been living a small awareness of God, a small awareness of life. And now Jesus the Christ wants us to have more life, more vitality, but we don't get there without going through unlearning. And so when Jesus the Christ says, and now I say to you, he's giving us a thought which is beyond where we are today and we're not going to understand. It's an intentional act of confusion because We have to let go of our thinking from yesterday, and we have to let go of our thinking from yesterday without a fully formed thinking of tomorrow. We have to go through a time of wholly not knowing. It's part of our accepting the first path. And as we move deeper into the text of Matthew, I think of each gospel having a signature moment, which sort of sums up the deepest practice of Jesus the Christ in our lives in this path. And in Matthew, I think that signature moment is the way Matthew gives us Jesus the Christ's passion. Now, when I talk about the passion, it's built upon the historical actions in Jerusalem, but it's not told as Jerusalem's story. Matthew's passion is the passion of the Christian Jews in Antioch wrestling with this summons to a larger future that is going to potentially have many people misunderstanding and not accepting them. And so what Matthew brings forward to us, and it's always, every passion doesn't create new detail. What I'm saying is every passion chooses from the details of what happened to give us the spiritual practice of that path. And the spiritual practice of that path, of the first path, is receiving the way Jesus receives Judas at the moment of the arrest in Matthew's passion. And if you read the text very closely, you will know that 2 lines before the arrest, Jesus says to the disciples, "Look, the betrayer is at hand." And then Judas comes to Jesus, and Jesus allows Judas to kiss him. And then Jesus says to Judas, "Friend, do what you have come to do." Now, this is the deep core practice of the first path. When we say to God and we say to Spirit, we are in situations not of our making and not, very possibly not of our own guilt in any way. Something has befallen us which is not of our desire. And rather than strike back in judgment and blame and acrimony and bitterness, what God asks us to do is to receive the work of this moment. That doesn't mean that we approve of what happened. It doesn't mean that we don't seek justice in some way for what happened, but it means that in the spiritual frame, in the difficult moment of the first path, where we've got the ash of yesterday's temple and thought and belief all over us, in this moment, through the power and the grace of Jesus the Christ, we too can look into the pain and the betrayal and say, God, Jesus, Spirit, Mother, help me do what you are asking me to do in my inner life for my own growth and my continued transformation. So, as we move through Matthew's Passion, you're going to note how Matthew brings forward all the historical elements of betrayal and amplifies it. Not for us to go back to Jerusalem and to retry that trial, not in any way to have thoughts about what happened back in those days, but to realize that this passion is here and now, and who's on trial is you. Are you going to accept the work of Spirit? Something has befallen you, and Spirit is asking you to pick up the work of it. How are you going to receive this moment for your growth in transformation and love? And so then we can move to the very end of this gospel, and the disciples are directed to go to the Mount in Galilee. And I love this element because I'm Lebanese. I'm first generation Lebanese. I grew up in a Lebanese village that just happened to be in Birmingham, Alabama. I grew up with my jiddo, my grandfather, and my sitto, my grandmother. I grew up in the old ways, and I understand that the old ways are in my bones. And I know that if the evangelist had given us the name of the Mount of Resurrection, that my jiddo would have been there 30 minutes before you get there with the souvenir stand. Have you ever thought about the stunning, shocking detail of not naming the new mountain of the resurrection? Because, and remember that this text is written to the Jewish Christians of Antioch who've just lost the temple, they've just lost their priesthood, and they've just lost the holy city. Wouldn't the most natural thing for us to do to comfort each other is to name the place that the risen Christ appears to us? And yet Matthew does not give us the name of that mountain, precisely because, and I would like all of Christianity to hear this today, I would like every spiritual tradition to hear this today. Jesus the Christ is ahead of us, not behind us. There is nothing of yesterday to go back to when you're wearing the ashes of the old temple. The only place to go is forward. And Jesus the Christ emphasizes that when the disciples are there. He says, and now I'm going to send you out everywhere. Well, gosh, thank you, Jesus. I want the GPS, I want the bank account, I want the blueprint, and Jesus doesn't give any of that. And none of us get any of that at the end of the first path. What we get is Jesus asking us to put our hand in His and let's go to an unknown future. To tell the disciples to go everywhere, because in the four gospel path that we're on, the end of Matthew is not the Great Commissioning. That comes in Luke. We're only at the end of the first chapter of a 4-chapter book. And at this point, Jesus is telling us to go out, very much almost like Tolkien, go out and wander and be lost. Because what I want you to learn in the second path is that in your lostness, I'm there. And that's the only thing that should matter to you. That the new realizations that are going to come to you are going to come further down the journey. But to get those new realizations, you first got to forget what was. You've got to move beyond what has been. You need to grieve it and release it and clear yourself out for the new. Because as long as your focus is on what was, you will never be able to see the new.
Why?
Because you can't see the new when you're clinging to the old. Your mind, your thought, your mind, your feeling is always on what was. You're eating it, you're smelling it, you're desiring it. You've got to release it and let God do something new with you. I mean, in a very pragmatic and visceral way. I used to do some work with congregations who had lost a church building, usually by some horrific fire. And my work with them, the first thing was to get them not to move too quickly to the new building committee. Go into the social hall, go into the tent, play around with the chairs, let your community live themselves into a new form of being with each other, and then out of that new life that you have in your midst, then begin to decide the shape and the form of the church to be built. It's the same way for us. That's a dramatic example, but it's the same way for us in our own lives. When we lose something, we often immediately want to build something or create something that was just the way it was. And that's precisely not what the Spirit wants us to do. The Spirit wants us to be here and now and listen deeply to the newness and the freshness that the Spirit is inviting us to. But to get there, we've got to go on a journey.
Darn it!
Yep.
Can't you get it and then go? You gotta go and get it?
Nope. You know, I didn't make the law. God created this sequence of how we transform. And this is one of the universal laws of transformation, that we have to go through a release is one word, a stripping is another word, a forgetting is another word. We have to go through a cleaning before we can truly live and see and know something new. You go through dark times, but dark times are not the end of the story. Dark times are the early part in the beginning in the story. Remind yourself of that every day. Make sunset and the 20 minutes after sunset every day, make it a spiritual practice to stop and watch the sky turn dark. And remember that that early darkness is the beginning of the new day. And what is true in the outer world is also true for us in the inner world. Not going to lie, the first path is challenging and it's difficult. Largely it's difficult because when we step out, sometimes we discover that friends and family around us aren't there supporting us. What I want you to do is, there is a community out there around my work. They're ready to receive you. There are many people out there who are ready to go on the journey with you, to walk shoulder in shoulder to this new uncertain future that we're facing. The greater future beyond that uncertainty, it's there waiting for us. But to get there, we've got to go shoulder to shoulder into a place of unknowing and let God lead us. To do that today, it's scary.
And you're trying to sell greater uncertainty?
I am trying to sell greater uncertainty because it is truth.
What's there?
There is the truth, there is the certainty beyond the uncertainty, and that's what we're all reaching for. And I don't know when we're going to get there, but I know we will. And if you go on this journey with me through these series of short films and through the book, we're going to get to the certitude that Mary prays on the fourth path. And I just want to bring it back to the first path. Right there at the beginning of the fourth gospel, Luke, Mary, in a moment of great personal difficulty and cultural difficulty, she prays the future as an event that has already happened because she has learned to trust God's promise. This journey of transformation is about moving beyond hope to knowing, to the knowing that Mary had that God's promise will not leave us, no matter how difficult, no matter how large, no matter how cataclysmic the challenges are that we face. God is here. And if we do our small part, ultimately all will be well.